everyone. Today we're going to talk about research questions, variables, and hypotheses. And when we consider doing research, there are certain elements that you're always going to have. We're going to have a research question. We're going to have variables. Usually it's 2 or more. And we're going to have hypotheses. So let's break these down and let's start with research questions. What is a research question? A research question, or a research problem, it's a query about a relationship between 2 or more variables. So some examples you might consider: does hugging a child influence their confidence levels as an adult? The 1 represents one variable, the 2 represents a second variable. Another example of a research question might be, is there a relationship between the amount of time studying and GPA? Or can one's anxiety level before an exam be impacted by chewing bubblegum, with anxiety level before an exam being a variable and chewing bubblegum being a second variable? The research questions are direct reflections of the problem that we're investigating. A research question is also going to decipher whether or not there's a relationship among the variables. This relationship can be whether or not 2 variables are different from each other, whether they are correlational with each other, whether one can predict the other. So there's a lot of different relationships that it can look for, but it's going to test to see if there's a relationship between 2 variables. Another thing that's important is the relationship has to be capable of being tested, empirically tested. So I keep mentioning variables. Let's break down some variables. What is a variable? A variable is a condition or a characteristic that can take on different value or category among subjects in a sample population. So what does that mean? That was a big long sentence. A variable is something that we break into categories or values, and it's going to be something that represents one specific behavior or measure of the sample population. So it might be something like height or weight or IQ or favorite sport, or whether or not someone has pets. Those would all be variables. You can have a continuous variable, which is also known as a quantitative variable. And that's a variable that's going to vary in degree or in amount. It's usually involving numbers, so you're thinking of like height or weight or something like that. And it runs along a scale, which is a continuous scale. Again, with weight, somebody can weigh everywhere in between 10 pounds, well, not a human, baby could weigh 10 pounds, everywhere between 10 pounds and 500 pounds. I mean, and it keeps going, but you could be 140 pounds and 0.27 ounces. You know, I mean, it can just, you can break it down, right? It's on a scale. So that's a quantitative variable, or a continuous variable, because the scale continues and the measures are usually equal distances between each other. They're known in equal distances. You can also have a categorical variable, which is qualitative, typically, or considered qualitative. That does not mean that you're doing qualitative research if you have a categorical variable. Qualitative research involves more than just a qualitative variable. However, a qualitative variable is usually, when we're talking about kinds or types of something, it's usually groups. So a certain type, what's everyone's favorite flavor of cupcake, or something like that. Gender is a good example. Some other examples for continuous might be income or weight in pounds. Categorical examples might be religious affiliation or favorite sport. Variables also, when we're doing research, we have one independent variable and one dependent variable. Now, as we advance in our research and in our statistics and in our quantitative analysis, we're going to come to understand that you can have more variables. But let's get this dialed in first, and let's just start with one independent and one dependent variable. That's kind of the best place to start. So our independent variable is the variable that's presumed to cause a change in the other. It's the one that is affecting the other variable. If we're doing an experimental research, the independent variable is manipulated by the researcher. Think of if you're testing a medication and you're doing an experiment so everyone has their pre-measure, and then you're going to give half the group a certain vitamin and you're going to give the other half the group a placebo. That is the manipulation, whether or not they're getting the vitamin or the placebo. So that would be an experiment, then you would measure it again as a post-test. In non-experimental research, the independent variable is studied by the researcher. Can't always be manipulated. So it's still the one that is causing or having an effect on the other variable, but the researcher is not able to manipulate it. So we're just kind of observing or studying or watching or whatever it is that we're measuring, but it's something that we don't have control over changing. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the variable that is going to be influenced or be changed because of the independent variable. It's often called the outcome variable, and it's the one that's dependent on the independent variable. So its levels or its variation would be dependent on the independent variable. So the independent variable can affect or cause change in or influence or impact the dependent variable, and that breaks those two down. So let's see if we can identify some of these. I say go ahead and pull out a piece of paper. We'll kind of give this a minute or two, and I would try to practice this. And let me tell you a little bit about variables. Every single thing you ever do in statistics or research design, you need to understand the independent variable from the dependent variable. So if you're just learning this, if you're haven't seen this for 10 years, whatever the case may be, you really need to lock this in. So I would take the time, I would pause this, I would write this down, and I would just kind of take a scratch piece of paper and see if you can get this right and test yourself, because it will benefit you to spend some time learning these. You will need to know this for every future class assignment you have with me, for every class you ever take. The independent variable and the dependent variable, it's kind of one of those foundational things that will always be used. It's like learning your basic addition for understanding math. So go ahead and take a second, get out a piece of paper, and let's see if you can identify which variable of each research question is the independent variable and which variable is the dependent variable. I'm kidding. I'll stop now. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move along to the next screen. If it's been too short of a time, you can always pause me and start me when you want. And there we go. Did you get it? Did you get it? So, looking at the first question, does hugging a child influence their confidence levels as an adult? Hugging is the independent variable. This is the thing that we're measuring. And we're curious if that is what is influencing the other variable. So the confidence levels as the adult would be dependent on the hugging. Is there a relationship between the amount of time studying and GPA? The amount of time studying ideally should impact or influence the GPA, which would be dependent on the time studying. There is an argument that we could be looking to see if our question was such that do people that have, do people with a higher GPA study differently or study more or something like that, then we could switch it even, and our GPA could have been the independent variable if the question were worded differently. For the question, can one's anxiety level before an exam be impacted by chewing bubblegum? The anxiety level is the dependent variable. We are wondering if chewing the gum will influence the dependent variable of anxiety level. So our anxiety level is our outcome variable. Alrighty, let's move on. So we've realized now there's two types of variables, an independent variable or a dependent variable. And if by chance you happen to have more variables, they usually still will fall into those categories. Quite often independent variables, sometimes they have different names for them, but for the most part the basic design is one dependent variable and multiple independent variables. That would be the next step. Anyway, how are the variables measured? Well, we're going to give them operational definitions. We're going to use these to determine the precise procedures and operations followed in measuring a variable. So let's say I wanted to measure if I wanted to measure how something about someone's eating, I would have to define what I meant. Is it by their weight? Is it by volume? Is it by caloric intake? Is it time of day? Is it how many times a day? There's a lot of different measures that we could use. So we have to operationalize that. We want to define exactly what it is we're measuring and how we measured it. The other thing we need to know is what is the level of measurement for each variable. This, again, is a key, important, very important. I've said it like 5 times, I promise. It's extremely important to understand this, and this is what will determine how and which statistical tests we run. So we're going to go through the levels of measurement, and again, pause if you need to think about something or look it up or whatnot on the computer. Now, when we discuss the levels of measurement, what we're looking at is whenever we measure variables, we express them in numbers in order to measure either their dimensions, their capacity, their degree, their volume, their quantity. We want to measure whatever it is we're measuring, and sometimes these are going to be things that we want to give numbers to, or symbols. For instance, if we're measuring gender, it would either be male or female. We might code them with female being a 1 and male being a 2. So oftentimes we add numbers to things. That would still be categorical, even though it has a number. That number is a code, not an actual scale number or interval. So that's what we do. When you have a variable and it has a few different possible answers, like gender, we can stick with that. There's male and female. And granted, there's plenty more options as well for gender, but I'm just trying to keep it simple. Those are called attributes. So the characteristics or the categories that you might find in a variable, those are called attributes. Now, there are a few different measures or levels of measurement. One is nominal. Now, a nominal level of measurement is qualitative or categorical. I like the words categorical and continuous because I find that qualitative and quantitative tend to get boggled in my brain. So I like to say categorical. And a nominal level is something like gender, ethnicity, any yes/no response. The option that the selection that someone has, they're only going to fit into one category. They can't fit into more than one category. So you're either going to select yes or you'll select no. And those are categories, they're not continuous. And that is a nominal variable. And if you have a nominal variable, you would make a choice to pick a different statistical test than if you had, let's say, an ordinal variable. And an ordinal variable is a variable of categories. It's going to be categorical just like nominal. But the categories are rank ordered. So if somebody runs a race and they come in first, second, or third, the differences between first and second place might be 3 minutes, and the difference between second place and third place might be 45 minutes. So the measure is not equal distances, but there is an order to it, and that would make it categorical. So another thing that you see that's categorical very, very often in ordinal is a Likert scale. If something is not too cold, slightly cold, very cold, or freezing, that's in order. But again, the differences are kind of subjective. So that would be a Likert scale, and that would be an ordinal variable. And we also have interval or ratio variables. And these are actually two different. You can have interval or you can have ratio, but we sort of treat them the same. Ratio has a meaningful zero and interval does not, but they are both continuous measures. We see this often when we have something that is like weight or height. It's on a scale. These are also known as scale variables, continuous variables. They might, for instance, this one gives you the option of the example of number of children or income. So it's something where there's an equal distance between them, $100 and $104 and $112. The differences between these are equidistant, and they're on a continuous scale. So that would be classifying the variable as interval ratio. All right. Now we're going to try to do a little work on this. Are you ready? Here we go. So if you still have that sheet of paper, see if you can remember or guess at what is what. But if a survey question were to ask, what type of school did someone attend? I have no idea. Can you tell me this variable, what level of measurement would it be? Would it be nominal, ordinal, or interval ratio? It would be nominal. And the reason why it's nominal is because you can fit into one category. The categories are not in order. Oh, you know what? Actually, it might be ordinal. You could argue that it's ordinal because they are in order: elementary school, middle school, and high school. So they do go in order. We would call that an ordinal variable. For number 2, how many students attended your school? Or attend your school? Just kind of giving you a second to think about it. And again, it's going to either be nominal, ordinal, or interval ratio. And it's a fill in the choice, so somebody's going to write down 2,000, 1,200, something like that. Somebody's going to write down 35,000, however many, 6, it doesn't matter, however many students attend the school. That would be an interval ratio. So did you get it? Believe me, we're going to do this more. Don't worry if you didn't. And the last question we have, how long have you been at your current position? Less than 1 year, more than 1 year but less than 3, more than 3 years but less than 10, more than 10 years? What kind of variable would this be? This would also be an ordinal variable. So I know that we know the difference between 1 and 3 years, or 3 and 10 years. But if somebody that has been at their job for 4 years checked the third option, and somebody that's been at their job for 7 years checked the third option, there's a variation in that grouping. So we would call this a category and not continuous, and we would consider it an ordinal variable because it is in order. So that is an ordinal variable. Now that I've opened this can of worms, we need to think a little bit longer about this. The type of measurement and the type of question, those matter. So you can't always say that something is continuous or something is ordinal or something is nominal, because you can ask a question about a topic or about a variable in different ways that would cause that variable to be different levels of measurement. So let's look at like a dropouts rate at school. If the question were number 1, what percentage of students drop out of your school prior to graduation? You would fill in the blank with some sort of percentage, 64%, 12%, 2%. Gosh, I hope 64% doesn't drop out. You would fill it in with some sort of percentage. That would be an interval ratio answer, because you're filling it in it's a continuous possible scale. That would be an interval ratio. But if you ask question number 2, what is the dropout rate at your school, and you give these ordered options, that would be an ordinal variable. So we can't very well say that dropout rate or dropping out or school dropout rate or option out rate is always an interval ratio. We can't always say it's ordinal. As a matter of fact, if we look at question number 3 and we ask, do you believe there's a problem with dropouts at your school? The options are yes and no. So that means that dropout rate could also be nominal, because that would be yes or no. There are 2 categories that are not in an order. So it gets a little tricky. So you don't set yourself up and think, oh, well, whenever it's age, it's going to be this, or whenever it's weight, it's going to be that, because it cannot, if somebody asks, what is your weight in pounds, then you would answer, your answer would be, the level of measurement would be an interval ratio variable. But if someone says, are you over 150 or under 150? Well, that actually would probably be nominal, maybe argued as ordinal. So you always need to be careful that you have taken the time to properly determine which level of measurement your variables are that you're working with. Let's try this on number 4. Can anyone think of what number 4 would be? To what extent is there a dropout problem at your school? Not a problem, somewhat of a problem, a really big problem. So that would actually be ordinal, just in case anyone tried to guess that. Now let's move on to hypotheses. What is a hypothesis? Well, first and foremost, I want to be sure and let everybody know that there is a singular hypothesis with IS, and it is plural hypotheses with ES. So be careful whenever you're writing a paper that you get that correct. There are 2 types of hypotheses. One is a null hypothesis, one is a research hypothesis. The research hypothesis is also known as an alternative or a scientific hypothesis. So you'll hear those words interchanged quite often. And a hypothesis is basically an educated guess, and it is a possible answer to the research question. It's always in the form of a statement, and it should indicate what the relationship is between the 2 variables. So it should have something to do with the 2 variables. And it's the hypotheses that drive the research. Characteristics of a good hypothesis are going to be, like I said earlier, they're going to be statements and not questions. And they have a minimum of 2 variables. They have to be testable, and they discuss the relationship between the 2 variables. So keep that in mind, because you're going to be writing some hypothesis whenever you are writing research or research proposal, research paper. You're always going to talk about the hypotheses, And whenever you run statistics, you will always, always talk about the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is what we are actually testing or testing against. We're testing to see if our population does something different than the null hypothesis. And a null hypothesis basically is a statement that nothing is happening, that there's no effect or no difference or no relationship or no correlation. Nothing, not a zip, zilch. What we see is normal and within chance. If something is happening beyond chance, then we would have a significant statement and we would reject our null hypothesis. But a null hypothesis is always saying that, there's just nothing going on. So if we look back at some of our previous research questions, excuse me. Well, we'll do that in a second. Let me continue with the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis can be written as an uppercase H with a subscript 0. So a lot of people try to do the little O, but it's actually a little 0. And it's a contradiction to the research or alternative hypothesis. The research or alternative, actually one reason why it's called an alternative hypothesis is because it is the alternative to the null hypothesis. So when we ask a question, a research question, we always discuss what our null hypothesis is, and then we discuss what our alternative hypothesis is. And let's see if we can go farther. When we go back to our original research questions, does hugging a child influence the confidence level as an adult? The null hypothesis is hugging a child does not influence their confidence levels as an adult. So this is saying, nope, it doesn't. Nothing's happening. Is there a relationship between amount of time studying and GPA? Nope, there is not a relationship between the amount of time studying and GPA. These are our null hypotheses. Think of null is another word for like not a nil, zip. Nothing's happening. And I know I say that every time, but that's how I just had to say that for years until it became natural. Can one's anxiety level before an exam be impacted by chewing bubblegum? The level of anxiety one has prior to taking an exam is not impacted by chewing gum. So that is the null hypothesis. So we're going to propose a research question. We're also going to discuss the null hypothesis, which is just there because of the research question. It is saying that there's nothing happening. But we're also going to discuss an alternative or a research hypothesis. So let's look at those. So we go back to the original research question. Does hugging a child influence the confidence levels as an adult, their confidence levels? Hugging a child does not influence their confidence levels as an adult. The alternative hypothesis is that hugging a child does influence the confidence level as an adult. That kind of works, huh? Does it kind of make sense? I think it kind of does. The hardest part is getting from the research question to the null. But once you do that, the alternative is the alternative. It's the other one. Is there a relationship between the amount of time studying and GPA? There is not a relationship between the amount of time studying and GPA. The alternative hypothesis is there is a positive relationship between amount of time studying and GPA. Does that make sense? I hope so. Research question, can one's anxiety level before an exam be impacted by chewing bubblegum? The null hypothesis would be the level of anxiety one has prior to taking an exam is not impacted by chewing bubblegum. And the alternative or the research hypothesis is the level of anxiety one has prior to taking an exam is impacted by chewing bubblegum. So what we would do now, let's take research question 3. If we were going to actually do this, we would develop our research question. We would discuss our null hypothesis, our research hypothesis. Then we would go to the literature and go to the previous studies and see what other people have done. We would then run our experiment. So we would have a lot of people taking an exam and asking them what their level of anxiety is. Maybe every other exam they would chew gum, or maybe half the room would chew gum and half the room wouldn't. And we would do these things. We would run these tests and these experiments and collect the data, and then we would run statistical analysis to see what the answer is. And just a little note, a little side note, but I actually thought of this example question because I do not like to fly. I don't know if any of you don't like to fly, but I do not like to fly. And there was a study out that said if you don't like to fly, that chewing gum on a plane does not only help your ears pop, but it actually keeps your anxiety level lower, because of the fight or flight that we had as back in the hunter-gatherer days when we were, I guess, back in the cavemen, like a long time ago. If you are chewing, your fright system, your fear system cannot kick in because it thinks it's, I guess we don't get hungry if we're really scared or something like this. I don't know, but I had like a pack of gum the last time I was on a plane. So I don't know if it works with exams, but if some of you have really bad test anxiety, you might want to try it. So if you're chewing, your body thinks that it's hungry, so it therefore feels that it is safe, so it keeps the adrenaline lower, the adrenal secretions lower, and you're supposed to not get into as high of an anxiety level. So you can give it a try. Anyway, that is it for today for the research question and hypotheses and variables. I hope this was clear. If it's not, this is one of those ones you might want to watch again. You might want to mark it and keep it because you definitely want to know this as you go forward in class. And if you have any questions, be sure and email me. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.